Night fell over Peppa Pig's house. It all began ordinarily, dinner, casual conversation, but something hung in the air. Peppa felt her parents were acting differently. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig sat at the table too quietly. Their eyes reflected the light of the lamp, but inside, there was nothing, like two glass orbs, no emotions, no warmth. Peppa pushed her plate away, a lump stuck in her throat. George, usually restless, sat silently, clutching his dinosaur tightly. The silence at the table was so heavy that the ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes. Later, deep in the night, Peppa woke to a strange sound. Something rustled dully in the corridor. She woke George, and together, they cautiously left their room. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker of a lamp from the living room. They came closer and peeked through the crack in the door, and froze. Mummy and Daddy Pig stood in the middle of the room, motionless, like statues. Their bodies swayed slightly, as if held by invisible strings. Their eyes were completely black, without a glimmer, and their smiles stretched from ear to ear. "Go back to bed," came Daddy Pig's voice. But it sounded hollow, like an echo in a cave. It was his voice, and at the same time, not his. The children stumbled back and ran to their room. Peppa hid under the blanket and couldn't sleep for a long time. It seemed like the shadows on the walls were moving on their own. The morning only made things worse. At breakfast, Daddy Pig smiled too wide, showing sharp teeth that had never been there before. Mummy moved around the kitchen with unnerving grace, her steps too smooth, too perfect, like a rehearsal of a dance. Peppa glanced at George, but he only shook his head. He was scared. At that moment, something shifted outside the window. First, a shadow, enormous, covering half the yard. Then a heavy step that made the dishes on the table rattle. And then Peppa saw him, Bombardino Cocodrilo, but not the one she once knew. His eyes glowed scarlet, his jaws slightly open, and every tooth shone like a blade. His massive body moved slowly, but each step echoed deep through the ground. He drew closer to the house, and with every lash of his tail, the walls trembled. Peppa shrank back from the window in horror. Mummy and Daddy didn't react. They continued their movements, as if programmed. Suddenly, a voice rang out. Not from her parents, not from outside. It sounded directly inside Peppa's head, low and crushing. "You're watching this! Press the hype button below the video before it's too late." Peppa gasped in terror. It felt like those words weren't meant only for her, as if Bombardino Cocodrilo himself was speaking to someone else, watching alongside her. She grabbed George's hand, and they ran into the corridor. But it was darker than usual. Doors that had never existed appeared along the walls. From each came whispers and rasping breaths. Bulbs flickered and went out one by one. From the living room came a scraping sound. The children froze. Suddenly, Mummy Pig stepped into the corridor. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her smile was far too wide, her eyes completely empty. Behind her appeared Daddy. They walked in sync, without hesitation. "Children must obey," they said together in one voice. Peppa and George rushed to the front door, but Bombardino's silhouette was already outside the glass. His shadow blocked out all the light. His breathing rumbled like a volcano. He tilted his head, and his scarlet eyes blazed even brighter. "We are waiting!" his voice thundered. The door swung open on its own, and a cold wind swept inside. But it wasn't the wind. It was the breath of the crocodilo. It dragged darkness behind it, filling the entire corridor. Peppa screamed, but the sound drowned in the roar. George cowered behind her, his hands shaking. Mummy and Daddy stepped closer, their bodies distorted, merging with the shadows. They no longer seemed to belong to the world of the living. Bombardino raised his claw and struck the ground. The house shuddered. Windows cracked, The chandelier swayed. He took another step forward, and at that moment, everything around began to warp. Rooms vanished, walls stretched and collapsed, turning into an endless corridor. Peppa clutched her brother and shut her eyes. But even through her eyelids, she saw the red glow of his eyes. The last thing she heard was the sound of a broken melody, like the beat of a heart, and a deep, triumphant growl. "Now you are mine." And the night swallowed everything. Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper. "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end. Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher, turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper, faint but clear. "She's ours now." It all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual, a walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the seventh day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. An ordinary evening in Peppa Pig's house. Rain drummed on the roof, the wind pushed heavy clouds across the sky, and inside there was that same cozy silence that usually brought comfort. The family gathered in the living room. Daddy Pig leafed through his newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, George played with his dinosaur, and Peppa was building a tower of blocks. Everything looked normal, but Peppa couldn't shake off a strange sense of unease. She noticed it first. The light in the room flickered, the lamp dimmed for a moment, and the shadows on the walls stirred. At first it seemed like nothing more than the wind and the storm outside. But a minute later, the shadows changed again. They stretched longer than they should have and began to move on their own, no longer tied to the people in the room. "Something's wrong with the lamp," muttered Daddy Pig, getting up and fiddling with the switch. But the light burned steadily. Only the shadows moved freely. They twisted, intertwined, and became more and more distorted. Shapes appeared on the walls that shouldn't exist. Crooked arms with unnaturally long fingers, twisted faces, grimacing mouths. "Mummy," whispered Peppa. "It's fine, darling," Mummy Pig quickly replied, but her voice trembled and her hands shook so badly that the knitting slipped from her lap. George whimpered, clutching his dinosaur to his chest. Even his toy cast a shadow that twitched oddly, moving differently than the dinosaur itself, as if alive. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, and each tick thudded like a chill in Peppa's chest. The shadows kept growing, stretching toward the ceiling, the floor, the children. And then one of them separated. It swelled larger than the rest, filling half the room. Its shape was uneven, like smoke given form. Two red points flared where its eyes should be. The figure leaned forward, and from its mouth came a deep, drawn-out growl. "Daddy!" whispered Peppa. But Daddy Pig didn't move. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling, yet no words came. Mummy Pig gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. The creature advanced, its clawed arms stretched toward Peppa, reaching closer and closer. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. And then something stirred on the shelf. Labubu, his glass eyes lit up red. The toy that had always sat motionless suddenly came alive. Slowly, he jumped down. His tiny feet touched the floor softly, yet the sound echoed as if he were far heavier than he looked. He stood directly in front of Peppa. His smile widened, twisted, almost monstrous. The creature froze, its red eyes locked with Labubu's. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rain against the windows. Then, from Labubu's little hands, a stream of thick black energy burst forth. It surged toward the shadow creature, colliding with it like lightning. The air trembled, filled with the smell of damp earth and burning at once. The creature hissed, its body jerking violently, tearing apart piece by piece. It reached toward Labubu with its claws, but he only lifted his gaze, and his glowing eyes flared so brightly that Peppa flinched, nearly blinded. A piercing scream rang out, so sharp it rattled her ears. The shadow writhed, as if being ripped apart, and with a final hiss dissolved into nothing. The family sat in stunned silence. George no longer cried. He only clutched his dinosaur tightly, his eyes wide with terror. Mummy and Daddy Pig sat pale and shaken, unable to comprehend what they had seen. Labubu stood on the floor, his glowing red eyes slowly dimmed. His smile softened, turned back into its familiar, innocent curve. He looked once more like an ordinary toy, but Peppa knew he wasn't. She stared at him, feeling deep down that he hadn't just saved them. He had enjoyed it. His smile, even when gentle again, no longer looked harmless. The shadows on the walls never completely disappeared. They still writhed faintly, but quieter now, calmer, almost as if obeying something. Peppa turned to Labubu. He was already back on the shelf. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes faintly glimmering in the darkness, following the movements of every remaining shadow. And his smile widened just a little more. Peppa hugged George tightly and realized this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. It all began with a small scratch on George's arm. He hurt himself while playing in the yard, and no one paid much attention. Mummy cleaned the wound. Daddy said it would heal by morning. But by the next morning, nothing had changed. More than that, Peppa noticed George had become different. He didn't laugh, didn't ask to play dinosaurs, didn't run after her in the garden. Instead, he sat by the window, staring off into the distance. His little fingers twisted a toy absent-mindedly, but his eyes, they were empty, as if he wasn't looking outside at all, but falling inward into endless darkness. "George," Peppa called softly. He turned his head slowly, and a smile flickered on his lips. But it wasn't her brother's smile. There was no warmth, no joy in it. It was something foreign. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. With each passing day, George grew quieter. He ate less and less, even refused his favorite ice cream. His skin paled, shadows deepened under his eyes. And one evening, Peppa caught a strange smell. It came from George, damp earth, mold, as if he had spent hours lying in some wet basement. She tried to tell their parents. "Something's wrong with George, he's scaring me." But Mummy only stroked her head. "Don't make things up, darling. George is just tired." Peppa knew. It wasn't tiredness. That night, a faint sound woke her. A soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Peppa slowly sat up in bed and saw George. He was standing in the darkness in the middle of the room, motionless. Moonlight fell across his face, and his eyes reflected it, so that they looked completely white. "George?" Peppa whispered. He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly and smiled again. The next few days were a nightmare for her. She was afraid to be alone with him. His presence made the air cold, as if he carried dampness into the house. Sometimes Peppa thought he had stopped breathing altogether. He sat still like a doll, and only minutes later would he take one long, heavy breath. And then, one night, what she feared most happened. A dull thud woke her. Peppa opened her eyes and saw George. He was lying on the floor, his body twisting as if something inside was breaking him apart. Two dark bulges pushed through his back with a sickening crack. They grew, tore through, and within moments became wings. Enormous, leathery, black. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. George lifted his head. His hands were no longer hands. Long claws scraped against the floor. From his mouth came an inhuman cry. "I'm not George anymore!" A violent gust of wind shattered the window. With one beat of his new wings, George shot upward. Glass rained down. Wind roared into the room. Peppa shielded her face. When she dared to look again, her brother was gone. On the floor lay his toy dinosaur, smeared with black slime that spread slowly across the boards. Peppa collapsed onto the bed and wept. She didn't know where to run, what to do. Her parents, it seemed, hadn't even stirred from the noise. The next morning, No one spoke of George. His chair at the table was empty, but Mummy and Daddy acted as if it had always been so. "Where's George?" Peppa asked desperately. Mummy looked at her calmly. "We've only ever had you, Peppa." Those words struck harder than the nightmare itself. She realized George wasn't just gone physically. His very memory was being erased. But Peppa remembered. A few nights later, a knock woke her. Soft, deliberate, against the window. She slowly opened her eyes and saw him. George, but not him. His face was elongated. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Wings stretched behind him, blocking out the moonlight. His mouth opened, and from it came a whisper. "You're next, Peppa." She tried to scream, but her throat closed and no sound escaped. And then she saw Labubu. He was sitting on the windowsill. His eyes burned red. His smile was wider than ever. The toy shook his head slowly, as if saying, "I can't help you." Peppa pressed her hooves to her face, her heart pounding wildly. She knew then, George was only the beginning. Labubu was not there to protect her. He was part of this nightmare, and now he was waiting.